Welcome to this ACEN webinar on WIL outcomes and participation for different graduate groups. It's such a pleasure to bring this webinar to you. It's one in a series of webinars that we've been presenting on behalf of ACEN relating to analysis of the GOS data. So that's the Graduate Outcomes Survey, which is that really large survey that graduates get sent around 6 months post-graduation or more, and they get to respond to different items on their experiences at university. As we begin this webinar, I'd really like to start with an acknowledgement of country, and I invite you to do this acknowledgement with me, please. So if you would like to open up your chat, please record the country in which you are currently located. Right now, I'm located on Dharawal country, which is on the eastern coast of New South Wales, Australia. And I'm located in Wollongong, and this is a beautiful place where we're nestled between the mountains and the beach. And what I'd also, so thank you so much. I can see some beautiful countries and acknowledgements coming through. The second thing I'd like to do in order to acknowledge country is I really encourage you to find a window wherever you're located right now. And I'm assuming you're inside a house or an office or some sort of building. And I encourage you to find a window and look out. I want you to find the mountains or the waterways or the trees, the small animals or even small creatures which are currently making up the country where you are located. And please just take a moment to pay your respects to that country and think about how we can work together to care for that country. And in doing so, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you so much. I can see some really wonderful descriptions of the countries where you're currently located. We are from everywhere, so much so that we actually had 225 registrations for this webinar. So I'm expecting that there actually will be many countries, locations recorded here as we all come together to listen to this webinar. So my name is Dr. Bonnie Dean and I'm from the University of Wollongong and I'm on the ACEN Board of Directors. It is my pleasure to host this webinar today. It's so exciting. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the ACEN website. This recording, as well as the slides, will be made available to you as soon as the webinar is finished, and we'll actually email it out a link to those who have registered as well. So if you were unable to make it, we will make sure that we get that recording and the slides to you. And to anyone else who wants access, it will be on the website. You are currently on mute and you are also unable to see your video. However, we would love for you to engage with us during the webinar and especially afterwards in a Q&A. You can do that in two ways. Number one, you can post it in the chat, or number two, you can post to the Q&A section, which is also down the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to write your comments and questions in either of those two spaces. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the two presenters of the webinar today. We have Professor Denise Jackson, who is from Edith Cowan University, and Denise is on the ACEN Board of Directors and is the lead of the WIL GOS project. We have Associate Professor Michelle Eadie, who is from the University of Wollongong and also sits on the ACEN Board of Directors. And Michelle is actually joining us from Canada at the moment, where it is evening time. So thanks so much for staying up for us to present this webinar, Michelle.
Pleasure.
So the topic that we're going to talk about is exciting. It's a really interesting one, and we can see that this is one that is really generating that interest around Australia and beyond. What we're doing is we're talking about work integrated learning and a few different types of work integrated learning and examining how those different types are actually experienced by students with various backgrounds. And the topic is WIL outcomes for participation for different graduate groups. So without further ado, Denise, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks, Bonnie, and hi to everyone. Okay, so an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Bonnie's given a bit of a background there on the GOS items, and the findings split into 4 areas. I will give you a bit of a heads up. The PowerPoint slides are full of tables and quite heavy going tables with lots of information on them. And I did sit and try to create graphs and try to split the data across multiple slides, but this way seems to be the most useful. So you can actually compare all the groups in one slide for these 4 different angles that we're looking at. So I apologise in advance to anyone that prefers visual representation, and we will walk you through the slides quite slowly. And obviously they'll be made available to you afterwards as well. So we'll be looking at participation WIL across the different groups, and I'll define the groups in a moment, the impact of WIL and different types of WIL on full-time employment, perceptions of overqualification, and also preparedness for work. So Michelle will be covering the first and fourth part, and then I'll be doing the employment stuff that's in the middle. And then we'll also be talking about broadly what all these findings mean in terms of implications for stakeholders. So a bit of a background. I think if you've attended the earlier webinars, we don't need to spend too long on this. We're probably all familiar with the GOS, as Bonnie said, gathers data on employment destinations and other things among graduates by the Social Research Centre. We have 30 participating member universities in 2020, 31 in 2021. We have actually combined the data for the 2 years for this presentation. And the reason why we did that is we looked at the data and the findings for individual years, and broadly the patterns are very similar across both, which kind of supported merging, and also to try to get a reasonable sample size for each of the groups. So because some of them were quite small otherwise if we took it on an annual basis. So the data that you'll see today is essentially an amalgamation of both years. Those are the 5 items which I think we've spoken about previously. We're actually only going to be looking at the first item, so that's participation in WIL, and then the analysis is drawing on variables that are in the wider GOS survey, so such as full-time employment, overqualification, preparedness for work. So in terms of ACEN's own items, it's this one here at the top. I think it's worth mentioning the 3 different types of WIL. I do get questions on this actually about how we chose those 3 questions. And this was, I think we'll all appreciate that WIL can be defined in many ways and can be collapsed into different groups in many different ways. But those are the 3 areas. We couldn't go further than that and go more granular than that, because otherwise we've got issues with graduates potentially getting survey fatigue or dropping off from the item. So those are our 3 broad categories that we work with for the analysis. In terms of the graduate groups that we'll be talking about, you can see the first 5 groups there are established equity groups based on government classifications. And then we have, so socioeconomic status. This is all of the data on these different groups are derived from government data. So socioeconomic status is by postcode. Indigenous is those students, so it's at the time of study that those identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander of descent. With disability, again, it's those students that identify themselves as having or being with disability during their studies. Non-English speaking background is determined by language spoken in the primary residential home. Regional remote is again done by postcode during study. First in family to attend university, that's determined by parents, either parent or both having attended university to do an undergraduate or postgraduate qualification. And mature age, we use the government definition of 25 years and above. And that's at the year prior, the end of the year prior to data collection. So essentially when they were at the time in their final year, when they were leaving university, were they classed as a mature age student or not? And citizenship is obviously international or domestic. So the reason why we included those final 3 groups, first in family is a derived variables. It's available to us as part of the GOS survey. I have to say it's slightly problematic in the sense that we don't have this data for all of the groups. So you'll notice as we go through that the base count, the count for each of the groups is quite low, or sorry, for this particular group, it can be low in places. For mature age, there has been discussion, I guess, in the literature, we might see it in our own practice at university, that there might be differences in the way that younger and more mature students engage in WIL and the outcomes and experiences for them, which is why we wanted to look at this as well. And international and domestic graduates, I think we're all quite familiar with the discussions around international students and whether they have equal access to WIL and whether their experiences and outcomes are the same as for domestic students, which is why we wanted to explore that group as well. So moving on to the findings, I'm going to, one thing I do need to highlight is intersectionality. It is important to recognise that some students might sit across those groups. They might not be confined to one. I think it's important to note that. Okay, and I'm going to pass now to Michelle, who is going to be talking about participation in WIL among diverse groups. And Michelle, just let me know when you want to proceed to the next slide.
Yep, that's great. Thanks so much, Denise, and thanks for everyone who's here today. I think Denise said, don't be surprised if there's a lot of numbers that are flying out at you when we start moving on in the screens. But if we can look at them as data that really is going to help us and to explain to our universities, why WIL is so important and the outcomes of WIL as far as students are concerned. I think it's almost precious. It's very precious data to be sharing. So the first piece that we're looking at is participating in WIL amongst diverse graduate groups. And you can turn to the next slide here. So we're looking at participation for domestic and international graduates here, and we're comparing participation between groups. So on the left, you'll see that there's a list of the different groups of students that had completed the GOS survey, and that, just reminding you, this is 2020 and 2021 that is combined here. The percentages indicate the proportion of the group that participated in that particular kind of WIL or type of WIL. And do note that the graduate could have reported that they participated in more than one type of WIL when they were going through the survey. So when we see some of the significant pieces, and we've kind of put them in red here for you. So we see the regional students have significantly higher participation in WIL than metro-based graduates. And this is driven by significantly higher results in non-workplace and global WIL. But notably, the regional participants significantly less than the metro counterparts in their work-placed WIL. The Indigenous cohort that was in the GOS survey, there was no significant differences between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous graduates. With disabilities, students with disabilities had significantly lower participation in any type of WIL for graduates with a disability. And this is marginal, but highlights some sensitivities to this sample group. When we take a look at the low and medium socioeconomic status that are listed here, the low, medium, and high, when we're comparing these groups to the high SES graduates, there's significantly higher participation in any WIL and significantly higher in work-based WIL and workplace than in the high SES, which has a significantly lower in the global WIL than the high SES. When we look at the English as a second language or non-English speaking group that's listed here, there's a significantly higher participation in any WIL that's driven by significantly higher participation in non-workplace and global WIL here at the end, but significantly lower participation in the work-based WIL. With the mature age students, if we go down to that row, you'll see that there's significantly lower participation in all forms of WIL, in any WIL, than their younger counterparts. With first and family, we didn't see any significant differences in this cohort. And when we talk about our international students or our overseas students, there's a significantly higher participation in any WIL that's driven by the higher participation in non-workplace and global, but significantly lower participation in the work-based WIL. So we've highlighted some of those numbers. There's other data that you can look through, and you'll have access to these slides if you'd like some more time with that data to take a look at that. So the next slide, actually, then, this is the graduate groups. We looked at the bachelor groups. Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
Michelle, sorry, I just wanted to jump in quickly. I should have said it beforehand. As Michelle flagged, we have highlighted significant differences at sort of 5% level between groups. And Michelle's obviously comparing, regional versus metro, non-Indigenous versus Indigenous, etc. But important to note that there is a sensitivity here to large sample sizes. So the bigger the sample, the more likely it's going to pick up a significant result. And so really it's important to look at percentage differences between the two. You might find that there's a 5% difference in one group and it's not marked as significant, but there's a 5% difference marked between, you know, two other groups, and that's not marked as significant. And that could be because of sample size. So just treat that with caution. And when you do review the slides later, if you do, then, you know, look at, don't just focus on the red and the bold. Okay, thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Denise. We're so lucky to have an expert in quantitative in the field of quant that is an important part of our WIL family. So thank you so much, Denise, for all that you do. So moving then from the graduate groups to the bachelor groups, or the bachelor only groups, which is the next slide. We're taking a look then at the significant results at the bachelor level only. And again, when we take a look at this with the regional has a significant higher participation in any WIL that is significantly higher results in non-workplace and global WIL. Unlike in all course levels on the previous slide, when we were taking a look at everybody combined, it's not significantly lower in a work-based WIL. Again, with our Indigenous versus kind of non-Indigenous, there's no significant differences between the non-Indigenous and the Indigenous group. But again, looking at sample size, so when we're taking a look at the count of the non-Indigenous versus Indigenous students, this is where Denise was mentioning the sample size that needs to be noted. Students with the disability at the bachelor level, there's a significant lower participation in any type of WIL, whether it's a work-based WIL or global WIL. And this is something that we'll note a little bit later in the presentation. When we look at the socioeconomic status, again, significantly higher participation in any WIL and all types of WIL other than global WIL within the high SES. With our bachelor programs with non-English speaking backgrounds, there's a significantly higher percentage of participation in any WIL that's driven by significantly higher participation in non-workplace and global, but significantly lower participation in a workplace WIL. So that was here in our, oops, I think someone else is helping me with the cursor. With mature age students, and we're taking a look at this line here with mature age students, there's a significantly lower participation in any WIL than their younger counterparts, non-workplace and global WIL, but slightly higher in work-based WIL. And in our first in family, there was a significantly higher, just right here, in non-workplace only. And our international students had significantly higher participation in any WIL, driven by significantly higher participation in non-workplace and global WIL, but significantly lower in work-based WIL. So what are some of the key pieces that we would like you to take away then from these two slides that we've just shown? And that would be next slide. So the key takeaways is that there are mixed results for regional graduates, and our expectations would be that they had participated in less work-based WIL held for all their coursework, but not just in bachelor only. The no differences in participation for Indigenous graduates compared to non-Indigenous is a key takeaway. But again, remember that we're noting the relatively small sample size for the self-identified Indigenous graduates that self-identified for the survey. Although not apparent for all graduates, there's less bachelor graduates with disability participating in work-based and global WIL, which is a concern, I think, for all of us at universities, and thinking about our students with disabilities and how we can better support them and provide them with WIL opportunities is something that we can take away from this data. The low SES participating in more work-based WIL and less global WIL, it's a bit of an expectation when we think about it, because global WIL often costs money to go overseas or to do an internship or an experience where you're traveling. And so this is a key takeaway, though probably not surprising to us when we're taking a look at the data. We do have some mixed results around the non-English speaking background graduates participating more in WIL relative to their counterparts, although proportionately less took place in work-based WIL, which confirmed our. And the mature age graduates participated significantly less in all types of WIL and overall than their younger counterparts for all course levels. So differences were of less magnitude at a bachelor level and significantly more, although a marginal difference, participated in workplace WIL. So those are some key takeaways from the slides around the participation in WIL. And now I'll turn it over to Denise to talk about the next point. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so just moving on to the impact of WIL for the different types of WIL for these different graduate groups that we've been focusing on. First of all, looking at full-time employment. So as we know from previous webinars and your knowledge of the GOS, full-time employment is a key measure that's kind of used for the STARS by the Good University Guide, and it's quoted in the media, etc. So this is the proportion of students or graduates immediately post-graduation that were available for full-time work and managed to secure full-time work. Noting that it doesn't have to be one job that's full-time, it could be a multitude of different jobs, but they need to be working for 35 hours or more. So we obviously want the proportion to be as high as possible. I've collapsed this down. This is bachelor level, and I'm just showing you any WIL and no WIL first before we open it up and expand into the different types of WIL. And I think the easiest way is if you start on the right-hand side. We've seen this data before. This is for all domestic graduates. So this has been presented, actually it was presented back in the webinar in March, I think it was. So you can see here the positive effect of undertaking any form of WIL. You've got 70.9% of those available for full-time work managed to secure full-time work, compared to 63.6% for those that didn't do any type of WIL at all. So just expanding that out to the different groups, you can see here there is a positive effect, and this is bachelor level, across the board. Apart from, we don't have a recorded result here, significant result, but I mean, and it's a 1% difference. First in family, you can see there's around 4 or 5% difference there, but noting the smaller sample, that's probably why there isn't the significant result there. So some of these range, you've got, different points there, I guess, different percentage differences between, for these different groups that did WIL or did not do WIL. Important thing to note here, we're not looking at differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous or regional and metro. Instead, what we're doing is focusing on the group of interest, which is listed up here. And then we're comparing those that did WIL and those that didn't do WIL. We're not drilling down into metro and all the others because it's simply too much data. And at the end of the day, this is what we presume everyone is interested in. So just collapsing that out to the larger table. So we've obviously looked at this top row, that's any WIL, and we've looked at the bottom row, that's no WIL. And what we're looking at now is the impact of those different types of WIL. So let's start with work-based WIL. Let's go to the far right-hand side. And you'll recall from the earlier webinars that work-based WIL has a positive effect on full-time employment among domestic undergraduates, and you can see that here. So is that the same for our different groups? Now, essentially, the answer is yes, and there are some very large differences here. I mean, you've got 10% here, you've got 13% percentage points, that's 12, etc. So you've got some really large differences there, less so for mature age, probably less so for first in family. You're probably looking at that figure and thinking, my goodness, that's low. There wasn't really a national or a breakdown nationally of international graduates' performance in full-time employment until quite recently. And you'll see if you go to the Quilt website, they actually have released a report specifically to international graduates. So, it is relatively low to domestic graduates. For that reason, all of these groups here, so you're aware, only include domestic graduates. So and then this one is international only. Whereas for Michelle's data for participation included domestic and international. So important point there. We didn't include international graduates in here because we felt that obviously their differences are so significant compared to with the domestic that it might, it might impact on the results for each individual group and not give a clear picture. So these are for domestic graduates only. So essentially, you can see the positive impact for work-based WIL for each of these groups is strong. So not only for the domestic group overall, but for each of these, although less so for mature age, less so for mature age. So moving to non-workplace WIL, again, looking at the overall here, you'll probably recall from earlier webinars that the impact is essentially it reports a negative effect, only by a few percentage points. Which says that those that completed non-workplace WIL essentially were less likely to achieve a full-time role, which kind of you think, okay, how could that be? So you'll see when we actually broaden it out to the groups here that the differences are quite marginal. Yes, they're lower for some, but not by a huge amount, especially when you're looking at the sizes, which is so we're literally talking a couple of percentage points, 1 percentage point there, a couple there, and so on and so on. NESB, it's bigger, it's not showing significant because of the sample size compared to other sample sizes. Mature age is significantly different. Now, this might kind of contravene thinking. When I was trying to deliberate over this, I was thinking, okay, I know in our programs, for example, we might give students at the undergraduate level, it's mandatory for them to undertake a form of WIL, and they either do a placement or they do non-workplace WIL, so project-based in our case, for example. So could it be that those, we're seeing here a bit of a difference of non-workplace WIL, and the other people in the other group are those that have done workplace-based WIL, but we can't make that assumption. The data doesn't go into that level of detail, but I would encourage institutions to probably have a look at course level and see what's going on here in reference to their own course structures and how WIL is designed and incorporated into particular courses. In terms of global WIL, you can see at an overall level, so you've got a positive effect. That also holds true for some of the groups. So you can see here for regional, marginal for Indigenous, you can see there for with disability and low SES. And there are also some other positive effects here. And there are also some negative effects. So this does require, it's somewhat mixed, but certainly for these groups, it seems to be positive. However, it's of less magnitude, like less, the effect is smaller than for work-based WIL. But clearly global WIL can be important. I think I also need to draw your attention to the fact that the sample sizes here are smaller, which is why sometimes it might not be showing as significant. And, this is perhaps because, well, obviously, because less people are participating in that, and remembering that we're drilling down at bachelor level here. So as we gather data over time and we have bigger sample groups, we might be able to get some more insights there. So moving on now to the same, but at all course levels. So I've done the same thing here. I've got the overall here first. Now you might remember in terms of, so this is full-time employment for all course levels. The impact of WIL as we start including the postgraduate coursework and postgraduate research respondents, you can see the positive effect of WIL gets washed out here essentially. And it's mixed. So it's negative for mature age, it's negative for international, although it's positive for with disability. So this, okay, I mean, it gives you some information there, but to understand where the drivers are, and, because obviously we've taken those 3 different types of WIL and then we've collapsed them into one group, it's more beneficial to look at the overall table. So let's have a look at work-based WIL. So again, we've got it here. You can see the positive impact, although noting for all domestic graduates, while there is a positive impact, it's less than for bachelor level. Which kind of makes sense because you would expect perhaps some postgraduates to really have work experience. So you don't have that strong signaling effect to employers that these graduates have work experience and it's not as important to them, or already there's work experience evidence on their resumes already from their prior work. So in terms here, you've got positive differences pretty much across the board, although interestingly not for mature age, those aged 25 and above. But the effects are less than for bachelor graduates. So they're there, but in terms of percentage points, you can see here that they're smaller. The one that does jump out at us is for graduates with disability. At postgraduate level, they seem to be harnessing the benefits of work-based WIL there more than perhaps the other groups. In terms of non-workplace WIL, interesting, again, there are negative effects there. Some are, again, treating the red bold as with caution because of sample size, but there are absolutely negative effects, percentage differences, apart from for Indigenous graduates. And the largest differences you can see is for your NESB and for your first and family. So again, we've got, that really requires a bit of digging into, and I'd say at an institution level might be useful, or a course level, depending on your sample sizes. In terms of global WIL, for the domestic graduates, it's not really evident. It's actually exactly the same. We're not really seeing any differences there. And there's really only, you've got a positive significant impact, again, for graduates with disability. Otherwise, they're quite marginal across the board. Okay, so key takeaways, and it's quite tricky trying to collapse that down into some key points, but I think the positive effect of work-based WIL, certainly at the bachelor level, is very striking. And, that could be because of, and this is not rocket science, this is evidenced effects in terms of skill development, professional identity, socialization, networking, etc., but also that signaling effect to employers of bachelor graduates. It seems to be very impactful. The negative impact of non-workplace WIL, particularly on mature age and international bachelor graduates, it requires further investigation. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what might be happening there, and that's really a point for others to think about. Global WIL seems to be particularly impactful for graduates with disability, which we thought was an interesting finding here. But again, we need to note the sample size there as well. Groups benefiting the most in WIL were broadly graduates with disability and low SES graduates, which might align with our thinking, perhaps. Marginal effects for Indigenous graduates, but noting the sample size there. And there were consistent effects for international graduates, being positive for work-based WIL and negative for non-workplace, and very mixed for mature age across the bachelor and the all-course level as well. So just the second part of the employment piece is perceived overqualification. So just drawing back to earlier webinars, you'll know that perceptions of overqualification is essentially the Social Research Centre uses an algorithm across 8 items to calculate whether graduates consider themselves as overqualified or not, compared to overqualified or not. And that is for full-time domestic graduates, apart from the international group, which obviously is for international graduates. Otherwise, it's domestic only. So we obviously want that percentage to be as low as possible. We want graduates to feel that they're doing their work in areas that's aligned, they're using their skills and it's aligned with their degree, etc. So same approach as before, bachelor level, starting just giving you a snapshot of any WIL versus no WIL, and you've seen this figure before. It highlights the positive impact of WIL broadly for domestic graduates, and you can see that carrying on here across all the different groups. And some of these percentage differences are are very big. They're around 15%, etc. I think they're all above 10%, apart from the ones that are significant. Obviously, Indigenous graduates aren't, but first and family and NESB slightly, or first and family slightly less percentage difference. But the interesting, I guess, it really is richer when you look at the collapsed the table that gives the type of WIL the detail for the type of will that they're engaged in. So we're for bachelor graduates here. You can see across the board, you can see that positive impact of work-based will, which, you know, is, and there are some very large differences there. Extremely large for NESB and for Indigenous graduates, but there's a real positive story there. Michelle mentioned right at the beginning about justification for incorporating WIL into courses and to enhance employment outcomes among our different student groups. I mean, there it is, really. Obviously, it depends on, you know, there might be some institutional differences, but nationally, there's a very strong story there. Not so much for non-workplace will. Again, if we look to the right first, you can see it's slightly lower. So there is some positive effect from will, but the only significant positive difference really is for regional and for those with disability and mature age. And you can see actually for international, it's the reverse effect. Global will, sorry, again, positive, but probably inflated due to sample size. It's only a few percentage points different. And you can see here, if you go through those, that they're quite marginal across all the different groups there. So nothing, you know, very striking to report. And the last slides from me, because I'm sorry, I hope I haven't lost anyone along the way. I know this is quite a lot to take in, but the slides will be there for you afterwards. Is for the all course levels. So we can see that positive impact of will on perceived overqualification again, although it is of less magnitude than at bachelor level. And, you know, we can see across the different groups there. But to understand this more, it's good to see where the actual drivers are for these significant differences. So let's look to the right for work-based will. You've got a 13% percentage difference there for work-based will. And essentially, there's a positive impact for all of the different groups. So again, a good news story, remembering this is at all course levels for work-based will. In terms of there are large differences apart from here for international graduates, is actually quite marginal. It's only a few percentage points. In terms of non-workplace will, let's have a look to the right. Again, very similar to bachelor graduates, there is a positive difference, but it's not of great magnitude. And you can see that the story is quite similar. There's a smattering of significant differences or ones of more than a few percentage points, all positive apart from international. So again, we've got that rather odd finding that international graduates and non-workplace will, there's definitely some consistent yet rather odd effects there. And notably, these are, while positive, they're of lower magnitude, less magnitude than for bachelor graduates. And finally, global will. So yes, global will, a significant difference overall, but we're only really seeing that at a regional level. And it's quite, you know, there are some, look, this is, for example, 7%, but look at the sample size. So I think I've already flagged that we do need to, it would be, in terms of, it's fine at looking at all domestic or all international, but once you start breaking these down into groups, it gets a bit tricky. So as we gather more data over time, it will become more useful. And just some key takeaways. So participating in any form of will is impactful, particularly at bachelor level, but it really is the star of the show, I guess, is work-based will, which is highly influential on overqualification or perceived overqualification. But non-workplace will is impactful, but not for international graduates. And global will, it seems to have less influence, but we need more data to be certain of that. Okay, I can stop talking now for a moment. So, and I'm going to pass on to Michelle.
Just before we move to the next slide, Denise, because I'm also just seeing that questions are popping up. And while we're on that slide, perceived overqualification, is there a definition of perceived overqualification, or where does that term come from?
Yeah, okay, so it's the SPOC scale of perceived overqualification, 8 items. And I can't remember the exact items, but essentially they relate to skills that I use, for example, the graduate might say they'll rate the level of skill or the skills that they used from their degree in their current job, and whether they feel that they use their degree in their current job. So, and then what the Social Research Centre does, if the graduate has responded to 5 or more items and scored 3.5 out of a 5-point scale above for those 5 items, they will be classified as considering themselves as overqualified. That's essentially how, so there's not one definition, but it draws on that scale of perceived overqualification.
And on those same lines, someone's saying, so is there the difference between workplace will and non-workplace will is also defined in the social science through the Social Sciences Center of what exactly they mean between the difference of those two.
Oh, so work-based will, in terms of the actual items, work-based will is internships, placements, practicums, and non-workplace will is all of it's project-based will, it's consulting, it's hackathons, competitions, it's anything that's not based in the workplace.
Thanks. And I just saw there were a couple.
No, that's good.
Popping up, and I thought, well, while you're still thinking.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah,
good.
So,
okay.
So the last little section
Yes.
then is for me, and that's taking a look at the impact of will on preparedness for work across graduate groups. And so when we are thinking about their perceived preparedness, graduates in full-time employment were asked, overall, how well did your qualification prepare you for your job? And they were able to answer on a Likert scale. 1 equals not at all, 2 not well, 3 well, 4 very well, 5 I don't know, or I'm not sure. So this first table that we're going to show you shows the proportion of graduates who rated well or very well. And so obviously in this chart, we actually want to see the percentages to be as high as possible. So I don't know about you, but I often run into students after they've graduated and ask them how they're going. We actually, Bonnie and I had met a student last week. We were talking about his the time when he was on placement and he worked in a community placement on country, and he was saying how important his will was to help him to prepare for his job. But it's really wonderful then that we have this data to us that, as you can see across the board, that the impact of their perceived preparedness and how will has helped them in their jobs was having any will was high across all of the groups of students that we're talking about today in the GOS data. So if there's ever any question whether this is how our students think that will helps them or not, then this is with the students that have any will compared to those students who have no will. So if we take a look at the bachelor level, then on the next slide. Again, breaking this down, and we're taking a look at the different types of will: any will, work-based will, non-workplace will, global will, and no will at all. We're seeing significant positive impacts on FTMP compared with non-completing work-based will across all of the groups. Yeah, and the non-workplace will is a significant positive difference for regional and Indigenous students with a disability. Now I'm just slowing down a little bit and showing you what I'm talking about, so I'm not so nervous. And low SES, as well as our mature age group. You can see the significant differences there. When we're talking about our global will, with significant positive differences for regional, Indigenous students, low SES students, our mature age students, as well as our international students, and particularly large for Indigenous in this category between global will having none of that and yes, having opportunities to have that. If we then break this down across all course levels on our next slide, then we're seeing again the significant impact across all course levels of students having any type of will, whether regional, Indigenous, with a disability, all the categories across, compared to having no will experiences at all. If we break that down a little bit across all courses, again, we're seeing that work-based will has significant impacts on our full-time students compared to non-completing work-based WIL across all groups, that there is positive impact from WIL for all groups and a large percentage of difference apart from the international students in most of these categories. In the non-workplace WIL, if we take a look here, there's significant differences only for regional students with a disability, low SES, non-English speaking backgrounds, and mature age students and international. So a positive impact from WIL apart from international in that category. And in global WIL, significant differences only for the regional groups around the positive impact for WIL. So key takeaways then on the perceived preparedness of these students at the bachelor levels. All types of WIL are significant and have a positive impact for all groups of our students. And at all course levels, there's a significant impact of completing any WIL for all groups, apart from the international student data that was collected. And although it's interesting to investigate different student groups and noting their participation varies, the bottom line is that each type of WIL, whether work-based or non-work-based or global, has a significant impact on a student's perceived preparedness for entering into the world of work. So when we take a look at some of the implications then for stakeholders, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But what we would like stakeholders to understand, work-based WIL is extremely valuable for improving employment outcomes across student groups, particularly at the bachelor level. And stakeholders need to find ways to minimize barriers so that all student groups can have access to WIL. For example, perhaps providing extra support in finding international or non-English speaking background students work-based opportunities and recognizing their strengths in different working environments, or providing more work-based global opportunities for students with disabilities, or encouraging greater participation in WIL amongst our mature age students. We need to consider ways to personalize WIL and to optimize the outcomes across the different groups for all students. More attention is needed to the design of non-workplace WIL if we want to use it to help improve post-graduation job attainment for different student groups. There's lots of room here for greater investigation and for others to pick up things at an institutional level, or if it's a personal passion of yours to continue to work, having greater investigation of the effects of things like non-workplace WIL on international student groups. That's something that might be interesting and worthwhile to look at. And time and more data really should help us to better understand the effects of global WIL on different student groups. And we're really interested to see, as we continue to collect this data, the differences as time progresses as well. Did you want to add something there, Denise?
No, thank you, Michelle. I wasn't going to add, but I was just going to say, I'm just mindful of time, Bonnie. We've got 10 minutes and I've been looking at the chats. And if you like, I'm quite happy to just whip through some of those because I can answer those quite quickly. Would that be okay?
Yes, please, Denise. If you don't mind starting with some of the questions around whether or not we have information on different student groups.
Yes.
So students who have caring responsibilities, gender, and those type of things. If you don't mind, that would be great. Thank you.
That's fine. Okay, so I'm starting from just below the acknowledgements. So data on students with families, unfortunately not, although there's nothing to say that an institution, because you have all this data at hand at institutional level, that if you have data, that access to that data at an institution level, that you couldn't filter that out and see if there were any nuances there. For gender, we do have whether students identify as male, female, and other groups. We do have that data, and I actually started incorporating that analysis. But when it came to the employment outcomes, we were, as you know, we're focusing on groups of interest. And I was like, okay, so who's the group of interest here? Is it females, males, and so on? So I actually removed that from there, and it was becoming, I think you'll probably agree, there's quite a lot in there as it is. In terms of SES, we go with all these variables, we go with how the government defines. So yes, it is by postcode. And I know that SES, that can be problematic because students might not be in their normal postcode during study. And there are other ways of defining SES, like parental occupation and education, etc., which is why we incorporate the first in family, although that variable is not perfect either, to be honest. Someone commented, I think it was Sarah Jane, commented on, I wonder whether the international ESB and NESB participation is affected by ability to work in Australia and the eligibility for work-based WIL. So just to clarify, that the employment stats, all of the employment stats and the preparedness stats are all only for domestic graduates, all of those groups, apart from the international one, which is obviously just international. So any data for the NESB groups would be only for domestic, those graduates that are classed as domestic, actually, at the time of study. So just to clarify that. We don't have any data on cold students and refugee background. Again, we are confined to what's in what's provided or what's merged into the GOS file. But again, if institutions have access to that data, then there's nothing to say that they won't be able to break that down further. In terms of the definition for work-based and non-workplace, hopefully we've covered that. And someone quite rightly asked, okay, well, where does service learning sit? And it really depends on whether it's service learning in the workplace or whether it's virtual. So, you know, for example, it could be the Practera, I'm thinking of our own students, the Practera experience that's in curricula, that's focused on shared values and embedding UN SDG goals, for example. So that you would argue would sit in the non-workplace. Now, do graduates that are completing the survey know the differences between all these, and are there likely to be some mistakes in their classification? To be honest, probably yes. I mean, it's not as clear cut as it seems. And we did do quite a fair bit of piloting and discussion on this, and I don't think it will be possible to get any perfect group classifications. I'm hoping that I've clarified about the overqualification, but yes, we don't want them to perceive themselves as overqualified. That is not a good outcome. And sadly, with well, it's a bit tricky at the moment with talent shortages, but traditionally over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of concern in the sector about graduates funneling into jobs that aren't graduate level employment. And that's what this focuses on. We want it to be as low as possible. And essentially, WIL, especially work-based, has a very positive impact. So yes, you might conclude from this that those that participate in particularly work-based WIL, seemingly that perhaps signals something to employers, and they seem to channel more into graduate level roles. Someone made the interesting point, and I can't find it right now, but about non-workplace WIL. Do you think perhaps it's not being included in resumes and etc.? So it's not being leveraged as much by graduates as work-based WIL is. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that's up to, the point that's on this slide here, more attention is needed to the design of non-workplace WIL if it's intended to improve post-graduation job attainment, and not just design, but also that whole career development learning piece where we go through with our students and making sure that they're leveraging all their different practice to make sure, to help them secure employment. And I think is quite, and that could cover award programs and all sorts of different things. Okay, I'm just scrolling down.
And Denise, there's just a question there which asks, do we have a breakup of these results for study areas, so different disciplines?
No. Oh, please, no.
More analysis, Denise.
No, we haven't. And the reason why we haven't is because of sample sizes. You can see, like, the global WIL, tricky. And you'll probably, whoever asked that question, probably thinking, actually, I'd rather know about work-based WIL. It is possible, but I need a bit... I need an assistant, or I need a bit more time. But I think as we gather more data, we absolutely would be able to break that down by discipline. And one of the board's focus at the moment, or key focus for the board, I should say, is to actually start drilling down at a discipline level into this data. So looking at the impact of WIL broadly on employment, participation, and whether we can then within each discipline also look by equity group or by these different student groups. It is possible, and that is next on our radar, so it will come. Okay.
Thank you, Denise. And just another clarification question around remote WIL. So if somebody's doing remote WIL, where would that sit? Is that workplace based or non-workplace based?
Oh, so if they're doing it virtually, you mean? Yeah,
Yes.
if that would class as non-workplace, which is an interesting question because of remote working when we designed these items, it was back in 2019, and absolutely, please don't we know that virtual WIL was happening then, but probably perhaps not to the same extent, because obviously because of what happened with COVID. But no, virtual would sit in non-workplace. But saying that, if a student reads those, or graduate reads those items and think, oh well, I did my placement and I did a lot of it from home, but I also went into the workplace, they would probably classify it as work-based, which they would be quite entitled to. Any others, Bonnie?
Yes, just one there from Wayne. And also I want to acknowledge those crows in your background who are happily joining the webinar today.
Oh yeah, sorry. I ran out this morning and put an owl on my balcony, and it's clearly not working. So
no, that's okay. They're meant
a
to be
fake
there.
owl, obviously. Sorry. Yeah.
So Wayne asked you can probably see that one in the chat, Denise, but I'll just ask this one. So does the power of work-based WIL dilute the significance of other styles? And then he offers an example. So impact of WIL on full-time employment, work-based WIL was significant, but non-workplace WIL was not, but the impact was still 70.8 compared to, does the no category for non-workplace include those that gained full-time employment after a workplace WIL? What are your thoughts, Denise?
Does it dilute? I think if we only had access to the data on non-workplace WIL, there are aspects of it that are very positive, that we would be applauding. And I think we should be applauding those anyway. And you might recall from earlier webinars that it is very impactful on, and actually the study that we did, Bonnie's quite separately, well, this is last year, the impact on skill development is critical, and Michelle's presentation on preparedness for work, also fantastic. I just think in terms of job attainment, and I'm not saying that we should focus on that, but because of NPIL and institutional funding, performance-based funding and league tables, that is the tendency to focus on that. It is, I guess, a poorer cousin, you might say, in comparison, but it's still holding its own in different areas. And as commented earlier, if and we've made this comment before, that if we are thinking that we should be leveraging it more for job attainment, then it's incumbent on us as practitioners to wrap that up into the experience and drive that home to the graduates and employers.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Denise. Now, we're in our final minute, so I just want to turn to Michelle first and then you, Denise. Michelle, what is your key takeaway for you as you were reading and analysing this data?
Thanks, Bonnie. And I just wanted to mention, I see that some people use the Q&A as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get some responses, maybe written out or something on our website. For me, the key takeaway was the proof is in the pudding with how much WIL helps our students get jobs and feel confident in their jobs. We all believe that that's what we're doing. And someone said, thank you for providing me with more evidence that the work that I'm doing is impactful. And so for me, that is that bit of evidence that we need sometimes to say, hey, yeah, we're doing the right thing and we're making a difference and we're doing, what the students need to be successful.
Thank you, Michelle. And Denise, your final reflection.
You mentioned about data analysis, so I have to say rather mind-boggling, so I do have to comment on that. But yeah, there's some really good news stories there, but there's also some lessons to us as practitioners on areas that we need to focus on around equity and access. And also I think, that whole career development learning piece and around trying to encourage students to really consider what they're learning beyond the placement, I think is important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to Denise and Michelle for taking the time to take us through this really complex data and putting it in a way that we can digest this and apply to our own WIL practice. Thank you so much to the both of you, and thank you to all participants who made it to the webinar today. It's a delight to see that so many countries are represented and that you've got these really great questions and comments and insights as well that continues this discussion on the importance of WIL. This recording will be placed on the ACEN website as well as the slides, so we hope that you can remain engaged with this data as well. We encourage you to look to your institution data and do your own analysis as well, and see if you can do a bit of a comparison to see what's happening at a national level compared to your institutions. Wishing you all the best. Please take care and stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.